I'm John Agnew. I'm a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, where I've taught for about 17 years. I've lived in the United States and been a geographer, a university geographer for about 40 years. I grew up in England in the 1950s and 1960s and used to come to the place we are today quite regularly as a child, and was always interested, fascinated by the social and political and religious divisions that were so apparent here. We're in the Clonard district of West Belfast, which is a traditionally Catholic nationalist area. And we're right next to what's called here the Peace Wall, which was constructed in the 1970s at the time of the greatest inter-neighborhood violence, which characterized this part of West Belfast at that time. So right over the other side here is a Protestant British neighborhood, because religious and national affiliations go together in this city. And the violence was particularly prevalent from 1972 until about 1978. After that, it became much more intermittent and was directed rather less at people in adjoining neighborhoods and more was a guerrilla war between the IRA, which was recruited heavily in neighborhoods just like this, on the one side, and then the security forces, the police force, which in those days was called the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the British Army, and also so-called loyalist paramilitaries. They were Protestant guerrillas or terrorists, depending on your point of view, who used to target civilians in neighborhoods like this. So this neighborhood is very redolent of me of the really quite stark importance of places in people's lives. In many ways, the violence here was about defending your space, defending your territory against others who were different, distinctive from you. Obviously, it was partly about nationalist aspirations, particularly on the part of the population in this neighborhood, which of course had been suppressed since the partition of Ireland in 1920, when Belfast, this city, and the surrounding area of Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom, and the rest of the island became what was called eventually the Republic of Ireland. And so you had at a kind of micro scale, at a micro level, encapsulated in these neighborhoods here, these very strong identities associated, with Ireland, in the case of this neighborhood, or Britain, in the case of the Protestant neighborhood over here. And yet at the same time, it was really also about defending your place, because both groups had a very strong sense of place, of an identification with their neighborhood as belonging to them. And I'd say from an early age, this was why this place always fascinated me. And one reason why, in my later career, not so much precisely in relation to here, but in relation to other places, I became interested in the connection between place and politics more broadly. So in many ways, it started here. It started in trying to understand what it was that in a way would even make people act very violently in order, in a sense, to defend, in their minds, defend their neighborhood against outsiders. I think my understanding of place is really quite profoundly affected by having visited here, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which was the beginning of the violence here, which is known euphemistically as the Troubles. That's what people collectively call it. Interestingly, on both sides, they've agreed on something, which is the name of what went on, which was essentially a low-intensity guerrilla war that went on from 1972 until 1998. Although the last few years were much less violent, and I think my writings, particularly in the 1980s about place and politics, were affected by this place in a very particular way. Most other people, particularly in the fields that I was connected with, political science, political sociology, tended to think of place very much in terms of, a location, a particular spot, which you could define in terms of latitude and longitude, a kind of fairly abstract notion of space. Plus, they added to that a sense of what Anthony Giddens, the sociologist, called locale. The notion is that people are located somewhere, but they also engage in various social relationships that are anchored in those places. They go to church, like the large Catholic church that's over here in Clonard, the Clonard Monastery. They go to school where they mix with other people, but only with some people, not with other types of people. They shop in certain places and they don't shop in others. They take certain buses but not others. And in a heavily segregated city like that, that was very important, I thought. And there was a very influential article published in 1969 on this area by Fred Ball, who was a geographer at Queen's University in Belfast, called Territoriality on the Shankill Falls Divide, which was an article exactly about how people didn't just live lives separated in terms of houses, residential segregation, but their everyday lives were completely segregated as well. And so I think that was, my view of place was really kind of reinforced by that understanding. But perhaps most importantly, I felt that most understandings of place, particularly when people were trying to understand people's political affiliations, their voting behavior, their propensity to engage in various kinds of political activities, strikes, violent protests, and so on, they tended to neglect what I thought, having spent some time here, was especially important, which was a sense of place, the kind of identification that people have with a particular city, with a particular neighborhood in this case, and with the people who lived in it. So that these nationalist heroes who are, on the wall behind us here, the members of the IRA here, who were killed in the course of the Troubles over the years, many of them were acting, partly out of a desire for a united Ireland. I mean, they had political goals, but many of them were defending, or at least in their minds, I think, were acting on behalf of their neighbors. It was more immediate than just a question of ideology. And so I think my understanding of place, which has these real three dimensions to it, location, locale, and sense of place, is in many ways very much a result of having observed and to a certain limited extent lived in relation to this particular place. I mentioned the place and politics. So in 1987, I published a book called Place and Politics, The Geographical Mediation of State and Society. And in many ways, that book was very much a product of this place, of having long thought about this. Actually, my first ever publication was about Northern Ireland and Belfast. When I was an undergraduate student in England in 1968, I wrote an article on unionism, which is essentially the idea of keeping Ireland, or later Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, and republicanism, the Irish nationalism, which had historically been at the heart of creating a politically independent Ireland. I'd written an article on patterns of voting behavior in Northern Ireland in general, and in Belfast in particular, at that time. So in many ways, even my later writing then on Place and Politics, which was often not about Ireland at all, it was about Italy, or it was about Scotland, or it was about the United States, was really quite powerfully influenced by this sort of early interest that I had in Irish politics in general, and Northern Irish politics in particular. So a whole string of publications down to my book, Place and Politics in Modern Italy, and that's, quite a long way away from here, but in many ways was influenced by the understanding of places and the effects that they can have on people's lives and their self-understandings and their political activities. It came out, in a sense, of early experiences in places like this. I think that over time, I'd say maybe two things have been important in terms of my sort of sense of how important this area, and of course the other side of the wall as well. I mean, this is a two-sided conflict here. I think two things have been particularly important. One is I used to think of this place as very unique, almost singular, that there was nowhere quite like it. It was the product of a very specific confluence of historical factors, the history of Scottish and English settlement in Northern Ireland, in Ireland actually, on the one side, and then the resistance on the part of a native population on the other. But I've come to see that, in fact, this sort of association between living in a particular place and politics maybe isn't quite as intense as it is here, but is much more general. And so I've come to see this place as less unusual, less strange in many ways than I think I originally thought of it as. So in that sense, it doesn't seem that now so different from many other places compared to, I think, of how I used to think about it. The second thing that's changed, I think, is I used to always frame it in very kind of Irish and to a certainly lesser extent British terms, that it was about these islands, it was about the British Isles, and somehow there were no other factors involved. And yet, what I've come to learn is that, even a neighborhood like this, people who live over the street here, have, relatives in Chicago, who raised money for the IRA, in the 1970s. That the economy of Belfast was always tied into the British economy much more strongly than was, say, the economy in what today is the Republic of Ireland. So Belfast had these strong connections to Glasgow, to Liverpool, and to other parts of Britain, which affected which created a very different kind of political economy in this region. So So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the much wider context, the networks, if you like, that tie this place to other places have become much more important in my sort of imagining of this place than they were, back in the 1960s and 1970s, when I tended to think of it very much as a world apart, as a separate, as a place that was somehow singular. And I think I've really lost that notion and have replaced it with, I think, a much more interesting idea that a place like this is a product of local ties, local social relationships, but also these longer distance networked connections that tie one place to others. I think that this place really does talk about a lot of the major trends that we've seen in around the world over the last 40 years. And this is, again, an outcome of no longer thinking of this as some kind of very peculiar place with a pathology somehow attached to it. I can say a number of things in this regard. It was always a bit of a mystery to me why the violence broke out at the time it did between these two communities in the late 1970s. I think on reflection it becomes quite clear that a lot of it connected with economic crisis in the economy particularly of this city. The decline of the shipbuilding industry in particular was important. The Protestant working class, particularly in East Belfast, to a lesser extent in a neighborhood like the one over here, had a kind of privilege in that many of them were attached to that industry. And that industry went into decline. The skilled labor force, which came overwhelmingly from that community, no longer had the sort of privilege that they'd had previously. They were now thrown into a labor market with all the people over here, where they had, in a sense, increasingly to compete. And this in a context of, in the late 60s and early 70s, of economic crisis, not just here, but all over Western Europe at that time. And so I think these uncertainties entered into a lot of the political life of Belfast in the late 60s and early 1970s on both sides. And I think this is what created the almost like put the fire under the two communities. And so so in a sense, one can connect these neighborhoods, these places like this, into a much wider set of political economic processes that were going on at that time. And we can see today that by the late 1990s, when finally the groups kind of came together in a settlement, at least amongst the politicians, it's not clear that actually has percolated down into much of the entire population, but there's definitely a kind of truce that's lasted here now for 14 or 15 years. And I think this is because that I think people gave up on that old economy, and a very new one has emerged here, which involves, all of the things we're familiar with. A higher return to education, for example. So parents have become more interested in investing in their children's education and so on than they used to. You can no longer take for granted that there will be this job or that one. And so this understanding that competitiveness has become more central to everyone's lives, I think has also then cast itself over this city. So this neighborhood, that one over there, they all in a sense share this kind of sense of a new world, which is no longer can be bounded by terms like Ireland and Britain, that your future, in a sense, is tied into a much larger world. And you can see this with local initiatives here. As you know, this weekend, the so-called Giro d'Italia, which is an Italian road race, has been extended. 3 of the early stages are all going to be here in Northern Ireland and over the border into the Republic today and tomorrow. Well, this is an initiative of the Northern Ireland Tourist Board, attempting, in a sense, to attract tourists, use this as kind of almost like free advertising for this particular place. But this notion that it isn't a world apart, that it is connected to other places, has become, I think, a very important part of the popular imagination here now. So I don't see a return, actually, to a lot of the inter-neighborhood struggles that characterized this place in the 1970s and 1980s, because I think in many ways people have upscaled, if you like, their sense of where things now matter. And it's no longer that you're competing with people over there. You're competing with people now in China. This is the kind of world that we live in. Yeah, well, my whole emphasis on trying to understand people's political lives has always been grounded in this notion that people don't just live in the air or in the ether or on a pinhead or something. So space matters for me in terms of these various dimensions of life that we face. We face a world where these are also dynamic. They're not. So space to me isn't the dead, the undialectical, and so on, which is always quoted from that famous quotation about his only important quotation about space from Michel Foucault. But is in fact something that is alive and dynamic. And so spatial relationships change. That's really what I've been trying to talk about. So the relationship of these neighborhoods here has changed. People's expectations have changed and so on, partly from external pressures coming from the larger world economy, decisions made by governments in London and in Dublin as well as locally and so on. So you can only understand the world in terms of how these things all come together in particular places. So there is for me, no placeless world. Okay, we can talk about how communications technologies have shrunk distance. We can talk about how various technological innovations have made the world a smaller place than it used to be. There's no doubt about any of those things. But nevertheless, people still, in a way, are tied into routines, behaviors. Their everyday lives are connected to their immediate surroundings. And I think this is going to be something that I don't see disappearing anytime soon.